The gate was a complaint of tired wood and rusted wire, the only thing separating Corinne's 2 acres of dust and defiance from the rest of the world. The world had made its opinion of her quite clear. Her own father, a man whose hands were as soft as his heart was hard, had counted out the last of her mother's inheritance into her palm and called it charity. The stagecoach ride west had stolen most of it, and the land agent in the town of Redemption had taken the rest, his smile a tight, knowing thing as he sold her the plot everyone called the Scrabble. It was a place where hope came to die, they said. Too rocky to plow, too far from the creek to thrive. Corinne was still breathing. That felt like victory enough. The first morning she saw it as she drew water from the well, her arms aching with the familiar burn of the rope. A horse, standing just outside her gate. Not a stray, not a ragged thing blown in by the wind. It was a fine buckskin mare, tall and deep in the chest, her coat the color of clean straw in the low sun. She stood as if placed there by a painter, her head up, watching the cabin. There was no saddle, no rider, just the worn leather of a halter and a lead rope trailing in the dust. Corinne's heart gave a lurch, a mix of awe and alarm. A throne rider, a wanderer lost in the night. She walked slowly toward the gate, her voice low and soft. The mare's ears swiveled, 2 perfect triangles against the pale sky, but she did not bolt. She watched Corinne approach, her dark eyes intelligent, and then, with a soft snort that misted the cool morning air, she turned and trotted away, disappearing into the low, rolling hills that climbed toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. The second morning, it was there again, in the exact same spot. Corinne had slept poorly, the image of the horse a restless guest in her thoughts. This time she brought a nub of a carrot she had been saving. She opened the gate, the squeal of the hinges a sharp offense in the quiet. The mare watched her, took a step back, then held her ground. Corinne knelt, holding the carrot out on her flat palm. The horse stretched her neck, her velvet nose twitching as she took in the scent. For a long moment she considered the offer, her breath warm on Corinne's skin. Then she took the carrot with a delicate pluck of her lips, her gaze never leaving Corinne's face. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully. When she was done, she touched her nose to Corinne's offered hand, a brief, startlingly gentle press of skin on skin. And then, just as before, she turned and was gone. That day, Corinne worked with a strange energy, her mind circling the mystery. The horse was no stray. Her coat was too clean, her weight too good. Someone was caring for this animal. But there were no ranches in that direction for 60 miles, or so the smirking land agent, Mr. Fletcher, had told her. Nothing but empty country, land the railroad had passed by and the settlers had given up on. When she went into Redemption for flour and salt, she asked at the livery. The owner, a man with a stained apron and cynical eyes, just laughed. A buckskin mare? Sounds like a ghost. Nothing up in the Callaway Canyons but ghosts and rockfall. He spat a brown stream of tobacco near her worn boots. You're the woman who bought the Scrabble, ain't you? Should have known you see things. The third morning, she was waiting for it. She sat on her porch step, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a tin cup of chicory coffee warming her hands. And as the sun bled color into the eastern sky, the horse appeared, materializing from the gray dawn like a memory. This time, Corinne didn't move. She just watched. The mare walked to the gate and stood, her posture one of patient expectation. She wasn't looking for food. She wasn't lost. She was waiting. Corinne looked closer, her eyes tracing the lines of the animal. And then she saw it, high on the left hip, a faint mark half hidden in the pale fur. Not the sprawling brand of the big cattle operations, but something smaller, more intricate. A spiral, like a curled fern frond, inside a circle. It was a brand she had never seen before. The mare blew a soft breath through her nose, a sound like a sigh. She met Corinne's gaze across the 50 feet of hard-packed earth, and for the first time, Corinne felt the encounter not as a mystery, but as an invitation. The horse stood for nearly an hour, a silent sentinel, before turning with that same unhurried grace and trotting back the way she had come. The silence she left behind was heavier than before. That night, Corinne didn't sleep at all. She thought of the men in town laughing. She thought of her father's dismissive face. They had all told her she had bought nothing, that she had come to the edge of the world to fail in private. But for 3 days, something beautiful and alive had come to her gate. It had chosen her gate. Everyone else saw nothing when they looked at her land, her life. The horse saw something. On the 4th morning, Corinne didn't bring a carrot. She pulled on her sturdiest boots, filled a canteen, and wrapped a piece of cornbread in a cloth. When the buckskin mare arrived, regal and calm in the dawn light, Corinne didn't wait. She walked to the gate, slipped through the wire loop that held it shut, and gathered the trailing lead rope in her hand. The leather was old, but supple, cared for. The mare turned her head, her eyes soft and unsurprised, as if she had been waiting for this all along. "All right," Corinne whispered, her voice husky. "You brought me a question 3 times. I guess today I'm following you home to find the answer." The mare started walking, and Corinne followed. The journey was not easy. The mare moved with a purpose that took no account of Corinne's shorter legs or the thinning soles of her boots. The horse led her away from any recognizable trail, climbing steadily into the foothills. The land grew wilder, the scrubby bushes giving way to tall pines that sighed in the wind. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of resin and damp earth. Twice the mare stopped at hidden seeps of water Corinne would never have found, drinking deeply and waiting patiently for her to refill her canteen. This was not empty land. It was just quiet land. Corinne saw deer fade into the trees like smoke and an eagle circling high against the impossible blue of the sky. The horse was a part of it, moving through the landscape with a familiarity that spoke of years, of a lifetime. The world felt bigger up here, and the town of redemption with its small cruelties seemed very far away. After what felt like hours, the terrain steepened. They followed a narrow, rocky track that wound its way up the side of a canyon. Below, a creek glittered. Above, the rock walls rose sheer and imposing. Corinne's legs burned and her breath came in ragged bursts. The mare never faltered, her hooves sure and steady on the stone. Finally, the track leveled out, opening into a hidden meadow, a secret swatch of green tucked into a fold of the mountains. And at the far end of the meadow, nestled against a stand of ancient pines, was a cabin. It was not a ruin. The town had been wrong. The roof line was straight, the stone chimney solid. Gray wood, yes, weathered by 100 winters, but the windows were glazed, not broken. And from the chimney, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke climbed into the still air. Near the cabin stood a small, sturdy barn and a corral. The whole place had an air of profound stillness, of being held outside of time. The decay-freshness law was at work here, on a grand scale. The ancient, silvered wood of the structures spoke of a place long settled, long forgotten. But the smoke from the chimney was a living breath. A neatly stacked cord of fresh split pine stood against the barn wall, the bright yellow of the raw wood a shock against the gray. The corral gate was mended with new rope. Someone was here. Someone was keeping this place alive. The mare walked directly toward the corral, stopping at the gate and waiting. Corinne's heart hammered against her ribs. She had followed a ghost horse to a ghost cabin only to find it inhabited. Her hand, holding the lead rope, was slick with sweat. Should she turn back? Flee before she was seen? But what would she say if someone found her here? A woman alone, trespassing. Before she could decide, a shadow fell over her. It was long and sharp in the afternoon sun. She froze, her hand still on the mare's rope. A man had come out of the cabin. He moved with a silence that was more startling than a shout. He was tall, dressed in worn denim and a dark shirt, his form lean and hard. He stopped about 10 feet away, and the silence stretched, pulled taut between them. His face was all angles and shadow under the brim of a stained hat. A dark beard, untrimmed but not unkempt, covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they were fixed not on her, but on her hand, where it rested on the mare's halter. "Let go of my horse," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together. It was not a request. Corinne's fear sharpened into something else, a spike of indignation. She had walked for miles, her feet were blistering, and this man, whoever he was, looked at her as if she were a thief. She did not let go. "She came to my gate," Corinne said, her own voice steadier than she felt. 3 mornings straight, riderless. I thought her owner might be in trouble." The man's gaze lifted from her hand to her face. He took in her dusty dress, her flushed cheeks, the determined set of her jaw. There was no welcome in his expression, only a deep, weary guardedness. "There's no trouble, and she knows her way home." "Then why did she walk 10 miles to my gate?" "A horse with a full belly and a safe pasture doesn't do that for no reason." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe pain, crossed his face. He took a step closer and the mare shifted, leaning her weight subtly toward Corinne. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he registered the small movement. He looked from the horse to the woman, a long, assessing stare that made Corinne feel as though he were reading the last 5 years of her life in the lines of her face. "Her name is Marigold," he said, the sound of it softer than his first words. "She does what she wants. Always has." He finally looked at Corinne, truly looked at her, and his guarded expression faltered for a second. "You walked all the way from the Scrabble?" The name of her worthless plot sounded different in his mouth. Not an insult, just a fact. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound exhaustion. He looked at the mare, then at Corinne's worn boots, then back at the mare. "Her foreleg is favoring," he stated, "the rocks on the upper trail." It was true. Corinne had felt a slight hitch in the mare's gait for the last mile. That this silent, hostile man had noticed it from a distance, and that it was his first real concern, changed something in the air between them. "She needs a hot poultice and a rest," Corinne said, her knowledge bubbling up, pushing past her fear. "A mash of bran and linseed would help too." The man stared at her. No one in Redemption looked at her and saw competence. They saw a spinster, a fool, an outcast. This man, this recluse from the forgotten cabin, looked at her and seemed to see something else. Or rather, he heard it in her voice. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod toward the barn. "The bran is in a sack by the forge. I'll get the kettle." It was not an invitation to stay, but it was not a dismissal either. Corinne hesitated for only a second before she unlatched the corral gate and led Marigold toward the barn's cool, dark opening. She had followed the horse home. Now, it seemed, she was being asked to tend it. The man, whose name she still did not know, had turned and walked back to the cabin, his long strides eating up the ground. He didn't look back, but she felt his presence like a weight, a question mark hanging in the clean mountain air. The barn was a cathedral of quiet industry. The scent of hay and horse and old leather filled the space. It was meticulously clean. The stalls were deeply bedded with fresh straw. The tools hung in neat rows on the wall, their metal oiled against rust. In the last stall, Marigold sighed as Corinne began to unbuckle her halter. This was no madman's hovel. This was the workspace of a careful, methodical man. A man who loved his horse. Sullivan. He had told her his name was Sullivan after an hour of working in near-total silence. Moved with a spare, contained grace. He brought the steaming kettle and a clean cloth without a word, setting them down on a bale of hay. He watched as Corinne mixed the hot water into a bucket of bran and linseed, her hands sure and practiced. He watched as she gently ran her hands down Marigold's foreleg, her touch firm but kind, locating the slight swelling above the fetlock. The mare, who had been tense and skittish around him, leaned into Corinne's touch, blowing softly. Corinne worked as if he were not there, focusing on the animal. She wrapped the warm, damp poultice around the leg, her movements efficient. She spoke to the horse in a low murmur, the same voice she had used at the gate. Sullivan stood by the stall door, arms crossed, his stormy eyes missing nothing. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she smoothed the hair on the mare's neck, the small, unconscious gestures of a woman who understood animals better than she understood people. "You've done that before," he said, breaking the silence. "My father raised Percherons back in Pennsylvania," she said, not looking up. "Before he decided I was more trouble than a lame horse." The bitterness slipped out, sharp and unintended. She straightened up, her cheeks flushing. "She'll be fine. She just needs to stay off it for a day or two." He ignored her personal remark, his gaze fixed on the careful bandage she had fashioned. "There's a cot in the tack room. You can't walk back in the dark." It was a statement of fact, not an offer of comfort. Corinne was too tired to argue. She was a guest of the mystery, and the mystery was unfolding one slow, grudging step at a time. She ate the cornbread she had brought, washed down with cold, clean water from his well. He ate a plate of beans at a rough-hewn table inside the cabin, the door open just enough for her to see his silhouette against the lamplight. They did not speak again. Later, curled up on the narrow cot under a scratchy wool blanket that smelled of leather and pine, Corinne listened to the sounds of the mountain night, the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, and closer, the soft sounds from the stall. Marigold shifting her weight, the rustle of hay. It was a place of profound peace, but also profound loneliness. She could feel the man's solitude like a physical presence, a wall he had built around himself and his hidden meadow. And she, somehow, had walked right through the gate. The next day she tended the horse. She changed the poultice, checked the swelling, which was already receding, and gave Marigold a thorough grooming. The mare stood quietly, seeming to enjoy the attention. Sullivan worked around the property, his movements dogged and purposeful. He sharpened an axe, mended a section of fence, cleaned out the water trough. He never strayed far from the barn, and Corinne was always aware of him. Their conversations were brief, functional, circling always around the horse. "She likes the mash," Corinne observed, watching the mare eat. "Lena used to make it for her," he said, his voice flat. He was standing in the doorway, the sun at his back. "Lena?" Corinne asked softly. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "My wife." The words were clipped, the door to that room slammed shut. He turned and walked away before she could say more. That afternoon, while he was gone, she explored the barn more closely. In the tack room, amidst the neatly coiled ropes and polished brass, was a saddle. It was a woman's saddle, smaller and more finely tooled than a man's working saddle. On the cantle, almost worn away, was the same brand she had seen on Marigold's hip. The spiral, the curled fern. She ran her fingers over it. It felt like tracing a secret. Underneath the saddle on a dusty shelf was a small leather-bound book, a journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was feminine, a graceful, looping script. It was a record of the seasons, of the wild flowers in the meadow, of the first snow. And it was full of the buckskin mare. Marigold threw a shoe today, and Sullivan was so cross. But I think he was only worried. He dotes on her. Another entry. He finished the new stall. He says it's for the foal we hope for next spring. The last entry was dated 2 years ago. The first frost came early. The air is so clear it hurts to breathe. I feel it in my bones. Sullivan watches me. He doesn't say anything, but his eyes are full of winter. Corinne closed the book, her heart aching. She felt like a trespasser in the deepest sense, not on the man's land, but in his grief. She put the journal back exactly where she had found it, just as Sullivan returned. He carried 2 grouse, and his eyes immediately went to the shelf, then to her face. He knew she had found it. She saw the accusation, the fresh wave of pain. "I was looking for a hoof pick," she lied, her face hot. He didn't call her on the lie. He just stood there, the birds hanging limp from his hand, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. The wall around him was back, higher and colder than before. "The horse is better," she said, her voice small. "I can leave in the morning." "Yes," he said. "That would be best." That evening was worse than the first. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a weapon. He stayed in his cabin, the door firmly shut. Corinne sat in the barn with the horse, feeling the chill of the mountain night seep into her bones. Marigold seemed to sense the shift. She rested her head on Corinne's shoulder, a warm, heavy weight of comfort. Corinne wrapped her arms around the horse's strong neck and cried, silent tears of loneliness and a strange, unbidden grief for a woman she'd never met and a man she couldn't reach. She had found the who behind the horse, Sullivan, and she had found the why of his solitude, Lena. But it felt like the end of the road, not the beginning. She had followed the horse home, and home was a locked house of sorrow. In the morning, she was ready to leave at first light. She had rewrapped Marigold's leg. It was almost completely healed, and given her a final grooming. She expected to slip away without seeing him. But as she stepped out of the barn, Sullivan was there, holding the reins of a sturdy-looking gelding. "I'll ride with you to the edge of my land," he said. It wasn't a question. "The trail is hard to follow on the way down." The ride was as silent as their evening had been. He rode ahead, his back a rigid line of rejection. Corinne followed on the gelding, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. They passed the rock-strewn canyon, the high meadows, the stands of pine. When they reached the low, rolling hills that marked the beginning of the land the rest of the world knew, he stopped. Below them, a mile or so distant, she could see the roof of her own small cabin. "You can find your way from here," he said, not looking at her. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. "For the loan of the horse, and for everything." He finally turned to face her. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by a weariness so profound it seemed to age him before her eyes. "She'll probably be back at your gate tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "She's taken a liking to you. Don't follow her again." "Why?" The question was out before she could stop it. "Why do you hide up here? Why let this place, and you, just fade away?" His face hardened. This was Lena's place, her family's, the Callaways. When she died, it died with her. I'm just the caretaker of a grave you disturbed. The cruelty of the words struck her like a slap. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning the gelding away. "I won't make that mistake again." She rode away without looking back, the borrowed horse a painful reminder of the brief connection she had felt. She left the gelding, as instructed, at the base of the hills, removing its saddle and bridle and giving it a firm slap on the rump. It trotted back the way they had come, without hesitation. Corinne walked the final mile to her cabin, each step heavier than the last. She had solved the mystery. The riderless horse belonged to a man who wished he were a ghost. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Corinne's life. The silence of her own plot felt different now, emptier. She kept watching the gate, a knot of hope and dread in her stomach. But Marigold did not return. The anomaly was over. The world was back to what it had been. Her, alone, on a patch of worthless ground. The town felt more suffocating than ever. Mr. Fletcher tipped his hat to her on the street, his smile thin and predatory. "Heard you went visiting up in the high country, Mrs. Corinne," he said, his voice slick. "Best be careful. That man up there, Sullivan, he's got no more claim to that land than a coyote. The Callaway title lapsed. County's about to put it up for auction. A real shame. Prime timber and water rights." He winked. A smart man could make a fortune. The threat was clear. Fletcher wanted the land, and Sullivan, lost in his grief, was going to lose it. The thought sent a spear of anger and a surprising, fierce protectiveness through her. It was Lena's land. It was the place Marigold called home. It was Sullivan's sanctuary, however painful. That afternoon, she made a decision. She went not to the livery, but to the county clerk's office, a dusty room filled with the smell of old paper and fading ink. She told the clerk she was researching old homestead boundaries. For hours, she pored over the heavy ledgers, her fingers tracing the spidery script of surveyors and the blocky print of legal claims. She found her own small plot, its boundaries as pathetic on paper as they were in reality. And then, she started looking for Callaway. She found it. A huge tract of land, granted by the territorial government before redemption was even a town, and she found the brand registration, filed alongside the original deed, a single spiral, contained in a circle, to be known as the Callaway Fern. And then she found the note, scrawled in the margin by a clerk 50 years ago. Callaway claim tied to continuous use of the fern brand and maintenance of the High Meadow Spring. Continuous use. Sullivan was still using the brand. He was maintaining the spring, the source of the creek that watered half the valley below. His claim wasn't lapsed, it was active. Fletcher was lying. He was trying to steal the land from a grieving man who had turned his back on the world. Just as she was closing the ledger, a new worry struck her. Fletcher was not a man to be trifled with. If he thought she knew the truth, that she might warn Sullivan, what would he do? The thought made her skin go cold. She hurried back to her cabin, her mind racing. She had to warn him. She couldn't ride, she had no horse. She would have to walk, and it would be dark before she was halfway there. She was pulling on her boots when she heard it. A frantic whinny from outside. She threw open the door. It was Marigold. But she was not standing patiently at the gate. She was wild-eyed, her coat lathered with sweat, her sides heaving. The lead rope was gone. And on her flank, there was a fresh scrape, ugly and raw. She plunged and reared, calling out toward the mountains. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The horse was the alarm. The horse was the call to arms. Without a second thought, Corinne grabbed a handful of the mare's mane and swung herself onto her bare back. "Take me," she urged, her voice tight with fear. "Take me to him." Marigold needed no encouragement. She wheeled and galloped back toward the hills, her powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath Corinne. This was no steady, patient walk. This was a desperate flight. The wind tore at Corinne's hair and she clung on, her heart pounding in time with the horse's hooves. The animal knew. The animal was her guide and her only hope. They reached the meadow just as dusk was turning the sky to a bruised purple. Corinne saw it immediately. 2 horses, not Sullivan's, were tied outside the cabin. The door was splintered, hanging from one hinge. And from inside, she heard the ugly sound of a man's voice, sharp and cruel. And then a sickening thud. "It's over, Callaway," Mr. Fletcher's voice rang out. "The land is forfeit. You sign this paper, or my men will persuade you." Corinne slid from Marigold's back, her legs trembling. The mare, her duty done, stood panting, her gaze fixed on the cabin. Corinne crept to the window, her heart in her throat. Inside, Fletcher stood over Sullivan, who was on one knee, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. Two burly men flanked him. Fletcher was holding out a piece of paper and a pen. "I told you she'd be trouble," Fletcher sneered. "That little spinster from the Scrabble got her nose in the county books. But it's too late. It's my word against a dead man's. Sign it." Sullivan looked up, his stormy eyes blazing with a helpless rage. He saw Corinne's face in the window, and his expression shattered. It was a look of utter despair, not for himself, but for her. He had tried to push her away to keep her safe, and she had come back, right into the heart of the danger. That look broke something open in Corinne. The fear fell away, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She was not a victim. She was not the girl her father had cast out. She was the woman the horse had chosen. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She walked to the broken cabin door and stepped inside. All four men turned to look at her. Fletcher's face contorted with fury. "Get out of here. This is not your concern." "You're wrong, Mr. Fletcher," Corinne said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "It became my concern the first time his horse came to my gate. It became my concern when you lied to me about this land, and it's my concern now." She took a step forward, her eyes locked on the land agent. "That brand on his horse? It's the Callaway fern. It's tied to the original territorial deed, a deed that stays active as long as the brand is in use and the High Meadow Spring is maintained. I saw it in the county ledger this afternoon. His claim isn't lapsed. It's older and stronger than any piece of paper you forged in your dirty little office." The two hired men looked uncertainly at Fletcher. The land agent's face went pale, then mottled with red. "Lies. She's a crazy woman, talking nonsense." "Am I?" Corinne's gaze was unwavering. "Then why don't we ride back to Redemption and ask the circuit judge? He's due in tomorrow. We can show him the ledger. And we can show him Sullivan Callaway, the last of the Callaways, who you're trying to murder for his land." The silence in the room was absolute. Fletcher was trapped. His bluff had been called, his lie exposed in front of his hired muscle. He looked from Corinne's resolute face to Sullivan, who was slowly, painfully getting to his feet. And then Sullivan acted. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man, brought back to life by a woman's courage. He took a step, not toward Fletcher, but to stand beside Corinne. He put his hand on her shoulder, a simple grounding touch that said everything. It said, "We." "She's right," Sullivan said, his voice no longer rough with disuse, but clear and strong. "This is my land. This was my wife's land, and you will not have it." Fletcher saw the fight was lost. With a snarl, he shoved the papers at one of his men. "It's not over," he spat, and stormed out of the cabin, his men scrambling after him. They mounted their horses and galloped away, their retreat a cloud of dust and humiliation in the fading light. The silence they left behind was different. It was not empty or cold. It was filled with the sound of their breathing, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. Sullivan swayed, and Corinne reached out, steadying him. He leaned on her, his head bowed, the fight going out of him, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and relief. "You came back," he whispered into her hair. "The horse came for me," she said softly. "She knew you were in trouble. I think she's been trying to tell me all along." He looked at her then, his stormy eyes clear. The grief was still there, a shadow in their depths, but it was no longer the whole of him. There was something else now. Awe, gratitude, a fragile, dawning hope. He had tried to save her by pushing her away. She had saved him by refusing to go. He gently touched the cut on his temple, then looked at his bloody fingers. It seems I'm the one who needed rescuing. I think, Corinne said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in days. We rescued each other. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her, and in the quiet of the lamplit cabin, with the loyal mare standing watch outside, the wall around his heart finally, irrevocably, crumbled. The autumn that followed was a time of gentle healing. The town of Redemption was forced to reckon with the truth. When the circuit judge arrived, the story came out, confirmed by the county ledgers and Sullivan's own quiet, dignified testimony. Fletcher, disgraced, sold his office and left town on a midnight stage. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed matriarch, had the decency to cross the street to avoid meeting Corinne's eyes. The whispers about the fool who bought the Scrabble died out, replaced by a grudging respect. Corinne never returned to her dusty plot. Her home was in the high meadow now. She and Sullivan fell into a rhythm as natural as the seasons. They worked side by side, mending the hurts to the cabin and the deeper hurts within themselves. He opened the sealed rooms of his grief, one by one. He told her about Lena, about her laughter and her love for the mountains, speaking of her not with the raw pain of a fresh wound, but with the quiet tenderness of cherished memory. He showed Corinne the journal she had found, and this time he read passages aloud to her by the fire. She, in turn, found a belonging she had never known. Her competence was not just accepted here, it was valued. Her quiet strength was a balm to his soul, just as his presence was a foundation under her feet. Her knowledge of herbs healed the last of the bruises on his face, and her steady kindness healed the rest. One crisp evening, as they sat on the porch steps, watching the stars prick the velvet darkness, he took her hand. His was calloused and strong, hers smaller, but no less capable. I was wrong, he said, his voice low. When Lena died, I thought this place died too. I thought I was just the caretaker of a grave. He looked at her, his eyes full of a light she had never seen there before. You brought it back to life, Corinne. You brought me back to life. It was Marigold, she said softly. She's the one who wouldn't give up. They both looked toward the corral, where the buckskin mare stood sleeping in the moonlight. She had chosen, and she had been right. The following spring, as the meadow exploded with wildflowers and the creek ran full and loud with melted snow, Marigold gave birth to a long-legged foal, a perfect miniature of herself. Corinne and Sullivan watched them from the porch, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. The cabin door was wide open, letting in the sweet, warm air. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a home. He had found his voice, and she had found her place. The riderless horse had known the way all along, leading two lonely souls not just to a hidden cabin, but to each other. The world had cast her out with nothing, but in following what everyone else had dismissed, she had found everything. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was a love that would last, a home that would hold. For those who have known true solitude, finding your one other person is the only vindication that matters. It's a truth some people search for their whole lives. Would you have had the courage to follow that horse, to walk toward a mystery everyone else called a ghost? Sometimes the things we are most afraid of are just love, waiting in a different shape. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of the Old West, and let us know in the comments what you would have done. You never know what's waiting just beyond your own gate.